Hi everyone, here to do our Monday scripture reflection for you. So it's a interesting topic this week because it's something kind of relevant to what we're talking about right now, which is the coronavirus in life. It brings up a lot of conversations about life and death. So I want to open with the Psalm, and our Psalm scripture this week is, "With the Lord there is mercy and fullness of redemption." So this idea of mercy and redemption is kind of a weird thing. When we talk about faith, we have these certain words that we use as Christians, and mercy and redemption tend to fall into that, where we use them a lot, but we don't always clearly know what they mean in life. And so I want to talk a little bit about redemption, because I think that's not always the easiest one to understand. Mercy we kind of get, right? If you do something bad, someone shows you mercy, it means they welcome you back into their life and they forgive you. But redemption's a little weird. Redemption is like, do we have to earn it? Do we have to do something to make sure that we are welcomed back? Do we have to do a certain amount of things or something like that? But really, redemption is this idea of what were you before, what happened, and where are you now? And so the thing to remember, first of all, is starting off with before. We're God's children, which means we're loved, which means we're good, which means we're meant for life, and we have all these things that we're supposed to be meant to live for. And then what happens is we do things that we call sin, right? Things that pull us away from God, things that pull us away from what's good, things that pull us away from love and from each other. And then we have to have this path back if we want to get back to those things. And so where does that path begin? And so in our first scripture, what I think is really important to remember, it's this reading from Ezekiel where we see that God promises us to show us mercy. And so that's really our path back. Even if we die, God's saying that He's going to raise us from the dead, right? But that could be a physical death, right? That's something that we talk about, and we believe in the second coming and the resurrection of our bodies at the end of times, right? But there's this weird thing that we can die in other ways too, right? People say when their heart's broken, or if someone that is close to them dies, they might say, a little part of me died that day, right? And so there's this idea that no matter what happens, we always have a path back, and that's really what God's mercy opens to us, that there's always going to be a chance that even if something dies, that there's going to be a path back. And then in our second scripture, in the letter of Paul to the Romans, what Paul talks about is, so if some things die and some things are alive, how do we tell the difference? And what Paul says is that we all have bodies, and everything in the world has bodies. And so everything in the world has bodies, therefore it can die. But what does true life come from? True life comes from what Paul says is the Spirit of God. That in the Spirit of God we find the Spirit of life, and that the Spirit of God is what really animates us. That's where our true life is found. So if we have a body like everything else in the world, plants, animals, all these kinds of things, I intentionally brought us out here for filming so that we could see some of that stuff in my backyard. But we all have these bodies, but we don't always have fullness of life. Because if all we are is a body and we die here and that's the end of it, well, then how do we live? We start living in fear of death. And that's not really living. If you're making decisions based out of fear, then you're not really living. And we can just look to how people are responding to the virus right now to kind of see that's not really living. So that's what Paul introduces us to, right? We have that open path of God's mercy. We know what we need to get back to, which is that Spirit of life. But how do we get back to it? Well, that's where redemption comes in. So redemption is this idea, like I said, that you were once something really good and you need to get back to that. But it's not that we have to do a certain amount of things. It's not that there's some measurement that we have to achieve to be good enough to be redeemed. It's that God says, if you accept the Spirit of life, then you accept me, and by accepting me, you come back into that real true living that only comes with Jesus. Because what Jesus says is that He is the resurrection and the life. And so what we need to do is to accept Jesus back into our life. Because if He is the way, the truth, and the life, if we accept Him back in, then we get that Spirit of life back. But He does say that also, that He's also the resurrection. So He says, I am the resurrection and the life. He says this in the context of the story of Lazarus. That's what our gospel is. And in the story of Lazarus, we see how a bunch of people respond to this beloved person of Lazarus. the brother of Mary and Martha, and we see their reaction, but we also see Jesus' reaction, that he was someone who Jesus loved dearly. And we see how they all respond. They all mourn him. They all let themselves cry. They ask Jesus hard questions like why he didn't save them or anything like that. And so we start dealing with these things. And when things start dying, that tends to be what we do. We respond in a way where we say, why is this happening? And that's a kind of a good thing, because that is really where the resurrection begins. If you let something die and you've never questioned why it died, well, then that's hard, right? If we just watched people die from this disease and we never tried to fix it, then worse things would get worse. But when we realize that things die and we ask questions, then that can be really helpful. And the same goes for our spiritual life. That if we are having really trouble with something, like if we have relationships, like friendships and romantic relationships, or our relationships with our families that keep dying, and we never ask why they're dying, then we can't really figure out the problem. But when we start doing that, and we start realizing where we're at now, where things are problematic, and we want to get back to that spirit of life that comes with a relationship with God, well, that's a really important thing, because that's when we start participating in that idea of resurrection. We see in the truth of nature, right? We see in the revelation of nature that resurrection is kind of a part of it. We don't really have it here in California, but we see in the seasons how things are born in spring, and summer they come to maturity, and then in fall and winter they start to die, and then they come back again, and we see this cyclical nature. We see this with plants. Plants get trimmed, like these plants need trimming right now. Plants die, but then they become fertilizer for new plants to grow up. It's just a weird thing that things die, but then they come back stronger. They come back with new life, right? The plants that grow after another plant dies and fertilizes the ground tend to be stronger than the plant that came before. And so we start to participate in this cyclical resurrection, right? This cycle of things dying, coming to new life, maturing, dying, and they keep doing that. And the interesting thing about God is that God doesn't say that you're never going to die. Is that God says, when you die, I'll resurrect you. That you'll never truly die. You'll never die completely, but you might die in such a way that you'll come back again even stronger than before. And that's really what redemption's all about. That when Jesus died on the cross, he came back even stronger than before, right? He came back in the fullness of God, right? He was fully human and he was fully God then, but he wasn't showing his full glory. And then after he died and was resurrected, that's when we got to see Jesus' true glory. And so that's something that we can think about in our own life. What do we need to let die? How do we need to let ourselves maybe even die in a way so that we can come back into our full glory? How do we let ourselves be redeemed in that sense? And so that's what I want to invite you into. How do we participate in this resurrection cycle? How do we get new life from it? And how do we come back even stronger? And so this week, as we do our Lectio Divina, I hope you can participate in that, and that let this be something that gives you an opportunity to participate in that mercy and redemption that we know God offers us.